this low confidence moment in China and what it's going to take. And you've said that potentially Beijing might move to do a whatever it takes moment. Why haven't we seen policymakers take that kind of assertive action yet?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that there's a constraint here. 10 years ago, they started this mandate of monetary tightening, trying to curb the bubble, basically. And it's very hard politically to shift away from that mentality. So they are phasing in by step the stimulus package. We've already seen a rollout of pretty major packages, coordinated way, monetary, fiscal, and there will be more coming along the way, but they have to figure out exactly what works and where it would take it to the real economy.
What do you make of the, well, on that note, what do you make of the current cocktail of stimulus measures, whether that's monetary, and to your point, they've recently pivoted the monetary policy stance to relatively loose, I believe, out of the PBOC last year. And of course, they've introduced now what they're going to do fiscally. Combined, do you see a path towards sustainable inflation?
Inflation? Well,
sustainable inflation.
Sustainable inflation. Well, I mean, that of course is a focus, but you know, people's expectations really have to change. And here it involves a lot more about building the foundation again, rebuilding the foundation based on saving the real estate. They're really targeting lower income households. I think that is the major structural shift. And they're talking about reforming taxes, you know, very narrow tax base so that you don't really have redistribution. I really think that the focus on the lower income households and future employment is really important because you have hundreds of millions of rural people who have the highest marginal propensity to consume. They don't have the proper social insurance.
That's a really big point because you have about 500 million rural workers in China. Their pensions are about a fifth of the percent of an urban worker, right? And that's a fundamental problem. It will be an enormous reform to see that change. Are you expecting to see any kind of that sort of fundamental change to social welfare over the next, I don't know, 5 years? What's the horizon that you see?
First of all, if we look at fiscal policy, I think one really interesting aspect is they're focusing on what they call village rejuvenation, moving industry back into the countryside and building up a consumption community around there, so creating employment, jobs. I think you have to start from employment, and of course pension reforms are ongoing. I think that there's still some bottlenecks there because, you know, you have the hukou system that prevents migration. You have 180 million or more migrant workers without the proper access to. But I think the industrial aspect of in the countryside and rural land reforms is actually very interesting.
Where do you see growth coming in short term? So short term this year. Do you see any pickup in consumption, or do you think exports in some way will remain the key pillar for this year?
Well, we'll have to see about the impact of the tariffs war, but of course, you know, all the talk is about consumption now, and the government is fully focused on consumption. It's just not that easy to do, right? I think that we have to separate the cyclical factors, which is people don't really have a rosy prospect of the future and sustainable employment and wage increases, so they got to fix that first, and then you have to fix some of the structural stuff. But so far, it's been really still exports driven. And it really depends on whether China can kind of move some of these exports away from the U.S. back seamlessly to other countries.
You've also written that potentially the Trump tariffs present a kind of opportunity to China, that China has already fairly successfully globalized its markets, and that has that sort of resilience. But I suppose the other side of the coin here is that we are now seeing frustrations from other countries. We think about the likes of Vietnam, perhaps South Korea, other Asian countries, who are concerned about this wave of Chinese exports coming into the economy. And Fred Newman, who I think you're speaking with over the next couple of days, has warned about this cascade of tariffs, not from the US, but from other Asian nations. So how do you assess China's resilience to tariffs from outside of the US?
Well, I think this is really a core issue going forward. It's not just about the U.S. tariffs. It's about this structural imbalance where this political economy model in China really favors scaling up supply and not enough raising personal demand. You know, we talk about social services. The local governments are more incentivized to nurture champions than they are to spend on social services. So until they fix that, there are going to be a lot of exports going everywhere. And maybe they will take up things like voluntary export restraints and things like that, but if they don't shift that imbalance, you're right, there will be backlash from other countries as well.
So on that risk, do you think the risk of tariffs from other Asian nations is bigger than the risk that China faces from US tariffs?
Well, I think that it's very hard to measure because everything is so interlinked and there are lots of intermediary products and it's a network. But I think that tariffs in general is going to be massively hurtful in the short run. I was talking about the unexpected consequence of Chinese companies having to find other markets. But overall, I think, though, China has kept a very firm message that they're going to keep globalization firm and even unilateral reduction in tariffs if possible.
And the other side of that is, what do you make of, Donald Trump has come out, let's say, guns blazing, wanting a lot of things. And, one of the comments I've heard recently is that if you really want to simplify what he wants to do is simply rebalancing terms of trade. Do you think he'll be able to achieve that in 4 years? Like, what would a win look like, realistically?
Well, I don't know what a perceived win looks like, but the first trade war did not work, the first agreement, because, look, the deficits in the U.S. is due to a massive fiscal deficit, and the surplus in China is because of the investment downturn due to real estate. So these are domestic issues that's causing this imbalance. Trade tariffs is not going to fix that.
I want to press a little bit further. What does a win look like, to your point about perception as well? What does a win look like from Beijing's point of view?
To have stabilized the situation, to not have escalated and exacerbated. Look, China's economy is weaker than it was the first time around. It is not interested in engaging a trade war. However, when it goes onto the negotiation table, it needs to be in a strong position. This is why there has to be a very robust stance. But to stabilize the situation, China does not want bad relations with, it wants a normal relationship with the U.S. if possible.
Yeah. I guess one of the comments we've heard a lot about is, China can't control some of the things outside. What it can control is, to your point, is refocusing on consumption. And I want to get your thoughts on this younger generation of consumers, right? This is a generation, if you think about it, a lot of them were born, if not right before, right after China joined the WTO. The internet was there. They're arguably the most well-traveled generation of China. They've seen the world, they've come back. They've studied abroad, they've come back. And wondering what economic implications you think that might have for the future in their mindset. I know that's not really a strictly economic question, but it's certainly an issue that you have to think about.
I wrote a huge chapter about that in my book. I think it's fundamental. They will change the face of China because they're big spenders, they're big borrowers. It's only because recently the employment prospects have not been so rosy that they're unable to spend. But one click on Alibaba's Taobao and they borrow to buy a lipstick. That's their way of life rather than the older generation. So once China stabilizes, they will be big consumers, big innovators, and they will actually be a great bridge between China and the rest of the world.